Welcome back to the Bitcoin Treasuries podcast. I'm Tim Kotzman. I'm here with Sam Abbassi, the founder and CEO of Hoseki. Sam, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can we start with a little bit of your background? I know you worked at Fidelity previous to now, but if you want to dial back a little bit further and just tell us about your background and your journey to Bitcoin.
Yeah, sure. It's been a wild ride, as usually is for most people in this space. Been in the space for now, I think 8 years or so. Worked on a bunch of random crypto projects in the beginning for the first few years, and that's how I learned about what Bitcoin is and what the crypto space is. Learned about Bitcoin's value proposition as a result of working on these other projects, learning about why they might be inferior, why they don't work as well, and what makes Bitcoin, this dominant, superior asset that we know it to be. The most recent gig before my startup was at Fidelity. So I worked in their corporate incubator, and that was such a blessing because, you have these corporate resources to build and develop things that you think and know are cutting edge in the space. And it was great because I was someone with outside experience pretty early in the space. So this is now 2020 when they brought me in. So having that context, having that experience of working in the field was really helpful in trying to bridge those things into corporate. So we did a lot of projects with MIT, for example, mostly around custody, some Lightning work, and some zero knowledge proof work as well. And but my degree's in economics. And before this space, I was doing neuroscience research.
Wow. Tell us about that.
It was traumatic brain injury research.
Okay.
I love research. And one of the things I love about the space is that when you research different topics and different principles, you can apply them really quickly, almost immediately, because there are no sort of barriers or constraints, so to speak, at least not, the way they exist in the medical field. So that research was basic science research, meaning it was the lowest level. So we're looking at biomarkers, and really the end result of that research is drug development, but that takes 10 to 15 years usually, and I'm not that patient. So that was the neuroscience bit.
And the economics background, what did you learn in school versus what did you find along the way? That was tough and disheartening in a sense, because I graduated with an economics degree and I didn't feel like I understood economics, I don't think, any better than I did when I first walked into school. And that wasn't that wasn't the professor's fault necessarily, or the professors or the department. I think it's more of the way they understand economics and the way they understand money to work, and that's sort of a generational thing. So really, I was taught Keynesian economics, no sort of introduction to any other school of economics. There may have been a quick just mention of the Austrian school. So when I learned about Bitcoin, it was the coolest thing for an economics student because, with respect to like building in the space, you're able to program money, and you're able to do that without permissions and without any kind of third party permission or license or anything, depending on what you're doing. And so that was like a complete open field, because normally it's money is something that's sort of fixed, and you can maybe try and like conceptualize it and sort of leverage it, but building it from scratch, building a monetary system from scratch was never an option or on the table. And so when Bitcoin came around and I discovered Bitcoin, I was like a kid in a candy store. So I had to relearn economics like completely because of Bitcoin. So really, this is like my second economics degree, I guess. And you've said when you learned about Bitcoin, what was it? What was that experience? Did someone mention it to you? Did you just come upon it online somewhere, or did a book fall off the shelf? Like, what happened?
Kind of falling off the shelf. It was a surprise, and it was unexpected. I think for a lot of people, that's their story early on. A friend told me about it in 2014. I was a senior in college then, and my mind wasn't in investing and like low time preference, long term thinking. So I dismissed it, and I wasn't investing or anything back then either. And then fast forward to 2017, I had my previous company, which was a web development shop. So building apps for clients, mobile apps, web apps, websites, like all the basic stuff. And this was down in Miami. But we kept getting inbound for different crypto projects. I had no idea what that was or what the space was, but these are contracts. And in the engineering space and with the kind of work we were doing, a lot of it is learning on the go. And so that's what I did. I was printing out like Ethereum smart contracts and just reading them and trying to understand what's happening. And so
so that was the exposure into the space. And I really focus on that because I understand what Bitcoin is because of my work in the like altcoin space, in the crypto space. And that was a blessing for me because I need to learn with experience. And so firsthand seeing, different communities, different incentives, different investors, and just different infrastructure was really critical in my understanding of Bitcoin's value propositions.
Can you kind of delve into what you just said, the infrastructure, the incentives? Because several people that I've talked to, they've gone through an altcoin phase, they might call it, and then they kind of land on Bitcoin. Maybe it's because they just were surrounded by a bunch of Bitcoin maxis and gave up. Maybe it's because they saw that on a chart, everything else was kind of trending down over a long enough time frame against Bitcoin, or maybe it was something else. But I bet there's like a lot of people out there that are just like, I know Bitcoin, I don't really know anything about anything else. And it might be helpful for people to know what the infrastructure and the incentives and the investors are in the greater space, just to have that knowledge base.
Yeah. I mean, at a foundation, Bitcoin benefits from this thing we call the Immaculate Conception, a term that we borrow in the space. And that's basically what I saw firsthand. Any other asset, any other system that's built subsequent or has been built subsequent to Bitcoin has the expectation of insane returns, like disproportionate returns. And that expectation does affect every part of the system itself, from its infrastructure to who's involved in the community and sort of what they want from this network, from the system, and from that asset. So I think that's the main. I mean, that's really what sets Bitcoin apart, is the fact that it was first and that it benefited from years of really no one paying attention to it and allowing engineers and developers to build and make mistakes, pretty catastrophic mistakes. But it was okay because it was limited, and the effects weren't that systemic in a sense. So that's the foundation of. That's what I realized as a result of working on that stuff, that the people who want to build, that was during the ICO sort of craze. People that are interested in building these assets are not interested in building a better financial world. They're interested in just making money, which is a component of us being in the space. I mean, clearly, as the asset appreciates, that's good for us personally, but that for me is a secondary effect of the thing itself, which is building a more honest and more robust financial system. So yeah, in terms of the sort of community and investors, it was all basically a result of that.
And how would you explain to somebody off the street? They're like, give me 30 seconds on like, what is crypto? What is Bitcoin? Like, how does it all come together?
Yeah, I'll use less colorful language that I usually use when I'm off camera. I just say, look, if you want to sleep well at night and you want to invest in the space, then buy Bitcoin. I'm not a speculator, so and maybe to my detriment, like there probably are a bunch of, and there are opportunities to make a lot of money in the space and the like altcoin like demographic of the space, but I'm simply, I don't have that risk tolerance. And also, a lot of these different, and let's just talk about the ICO stuff back then. Your exit liquidity oftentimes are people in developing markets, and so that seemed really grotesque in a sense. We're here in the West, we're building what we're basically sort of, the marketing wasn't matching up with what the thing itself was actually doing. And the people that suffered were the ones who were buying into that narrative. And oftentimes they're poor people in developing markets. And so I just didn't like that at all. And that just seemed very nefarious. So what I tell people is, and I get asked this question all the time, so I'm sure you do as well from friends and family, is I don't explain to them mining or anything really complex. Really, it's just scarcity. That's the thing that resonates the best, is Bitcoin is scarce. Mm-hmm. If they ask why, then we can kind of get into some points there. But what I tell them is, yeah, if you want to sleep well at night, just hold Bitcoin as if you were holding gold.
Well, let's spend a minute or two on the scarcity aspect, because when the ETFs were first launching in January of 2024, a friend of mine, I was like, hey, not financial advice, but if you want to buy some Bitcoin right before the ETFs launch, might not be the worst time,
Sure.
you know, if you're just kind of getting off zero recently. And they said after the ETFs launched, they were like, where's his scarcity aspect? Like they weren't around or paying attention, you know, last cycle or 2 cycles ago. So like, how do you think about the scarcity aspect? And maybe not to lead the witness here, but like, have we almost not even seen the scarcity aspect yet? Because as we go along, it becomes less and less mined each cycle, et cetera. Or how do you think about scarcity? And if someone would say like, well, price isn't really doing that much, how scarce is this thing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, with respect to price, so what we're witnessing is Bitcoin's price discovery. Both in the short term with day-to-day fluctuations, but also, you know, in the long term as well. The market doesn't know how to price it. The global market doesn't know how to price it. Some people know what it's worth. People in our space know what it's worth, but most people don't. And so we're seeing that sort of learning curve happen in real time. It's the price discovery for me is one of the most interesting things because it's hard to replicate this with another asset class. For example, when Bitcoin was at $9,000. I don't remember what year now, but let's just, at one point when it was at 9K, I remember looking at that and thinking that this is really cheap for this asset, which is strange because the market isn't saying it's worth more than what I think it is. But I know it is. And so with respect to scarcity, we see it all the time. I mean, we see it every day. The price may not sort of reflect that or reflect our understanding of how scarce it actually is, but it is doing that in time, and it does that really in 4-year cycles. And every time it explodes, and there's a better understanding of its characteristics and mainly scarcity. That's worked the best with normies in my experience. Is the scarcity, because that's an easy concept to explain to people. And oftentimes when you do that, you have to sort of go back and explain, well, what money is, and we don't have this concept of scarcity with US dollars at all. Definitely not in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So then you have to go back to pre-fiat money, and no one that's alive right now remembers that. So it is kind of a strange concept to explain, but it's not a strange concept for people to immediately grasp because they understand that concept. When you think of baseball cards, though that's inherently different than Bitcoin, that concept of scarcity, there being one of 10, is something you have identified as a kid. And so I think Bitcoin's most important characteristic is its scarcity. And to know how scarce something is, you have to be able to, know how much exists currently and how much will exist in the future. We can't do that with dollars or gold. So no one knows exactly how many US dollars exist in the world. There are estimates at best, especially with euro dollars, and now stable coins as well. And in terms of like how much will exist in the future with US dollars, we definitely don't know. What we do know is that we will not know. And with gold, it's the same thing. No one knows exactly how much gold exists in the world either. And we have estimates on its scarcity. It's the metal with the lowest inflation rate. Bitcoin's inflation rate is now lower than gold, but gold is like, I think, let's say 2%, maybe a little bit lower. And so, the estimates about gold being scarce and that gold is still scarce, that comes from the idea that we're not going to just find a plethora of gold tomorrow and then just, shock the supply. And we estimate that based on the amount of gold that we know exists in gold mines and the capital expenditure of mining more gold. In Bitcoin, all that's taken away. It's very simple, and we can audit the thing and know exactly how much exists at the smallest unit, which is novel for a macro asset. And you can do that without any third-party permissions either. So that to me is the most incredible thing, where I don't have to go to a licensed institution to see how much of this thing exists. I can just run a Bitcoin server on my computer and do it myself. And that is inherently novel.
Multiple choice question. How much gold is in Fort Knox? Is it A, more than we think, B, the right amount, C, less than we think, or D, none at all?
I want to go with D, but I don't know what that actually would be. Probably C.
Yeah.
And I only say that because I think the last full audit was during the Eisenhower administration. So, and I don't just sort of take things at face value. So I would have to assume that it's probably not what we think it is, given how corrupt the government has, acted before. and does now to a certain extent. So I'm very much in the don't trust, verify camp.
Yeah, the whole thing, you could go down a rabbit hole for hours or days, I think. I think I saw something a few months ago online where it's like the Fort Knox is here and then like JP Morgan's over here and like maybe there's a tunnel in between,
Sure.
like all these vaults.
But even with gold auditing or gold verification, it's called assaying, and doing that is complex and expensive. You have to get these big devices, and it's also like not that foolproof either, and it's just very manual, very mechanical. And with Bitcoin, that just doesn't exist. I mean, we can get to cryptographic signatures and verification, but it's clean, and there's no risk. There genuinely is no risk in that sense, because when you can verify that someone has custody of their private keys, that's just a mathematical proof, and that isn't relying on any devices or any sort of third-party technical tools. That's how the protocol itself functions and works.
So this might be a little different of a question, and it's not meant to in any way offend all the great people out there that are trying to spread the word and educate people on Bitcoin. But do you think that we're doing an effective job? Like, what books or movies or like videos or other resources do you point people to? And I literally was yesterday just thinking, how could we do a better job, because you can't touch Bitcoin, to like make it something that people can actually see? And the idea that came to my mind, it's probably a terrible idea, but to have like Bitcoin, the app, was something that people could download to their phone, because no one's ever touched Gmail either.
Sure.
But they find it very useful. If somebody would build like Bitcoin, the app, and maybe it's a layer 2 or something else where you could just kind of very easily, and maybe it's just reinventing Cash App or something. But I was just trying to think, like, what's a way to like people be like, oh, no, I have this on my phone, I've used it, it's cool. Like trying to like make Bitcoin almost into like an Apple product. So
yeah,
I'll stop rambling. But like, how do you think through current resources? And like, I've just had friends of mine that are not Bitcoiners say, no one is doing a good job of like really being able to like simply explain what Bitcoin is. And I think that's a complex topic.
No, and it's a great point. And that has to do with the fact that it's a multidisciplinary thing. It's both economics, it's both computer science, and it's also game theory too. And I've seen that in person. I've met computer scientists who don't see Bitcoin's value prop, and that's because they're missing the economics bit, and vice versa. I've met economists who dismiss it, but that's because they're missing the computer science bit. So combining those two is really like magic. In terms of resources, I don't have anything like that contemporary. What I usually historically have pointed people to is Mastering Bitcoin by Antonopoulos. And that is technically a bit more technical, but it's still in layman's terms. And there's parts of it, chapters that are quite high level. And that was the book that was one of the first things I read that allowed me to understand how Bitcoin works. Programming Bitcoin is the other one by Jimmy Song, but that is very technical. In terms of more high level things, and I actually got this question earlier today with someone, it's the price. Like the price action is the best evangelist. And we're seeing that with corporate adoption. People I don't think they're buying into it because we're doing a better job explaining what it is. They're buying into it because they just see the price going up.
Yeah.
And they see other institutions adopting it as well. And so that gives it more legitimacy. Bitcoin is physical. This is one thing I really have focused on too, is because that's the main criticism you get from people who like seem to be sort of allergic to it by default. And others who are still open to the thing they inevitably come to is the idea that it's intangible. And that's not true, because mining requires physical resources. So from that alone, it is physical. It can't exist in this sort of, like disconnected ethereal space. And that's how traditional financial instruments work today. They're not really that grounded into reality. They do live in this ulterior world. And Bitcoin isn't that. Bitcoin requires humans, requires resources, requires energy, physical things that exist in the material world in order to function. One, and then two, wherever the private keys are, that isn't technically where the Bitcoin is, but it's where the access to the Bitcoin is. And so if you have an open dime, or if you have a Trezor or a Ledger, if you have a hardware device where your keys are on there, you're physically holding Bitcoin. And that's It's tough because US dollars sort of in the same sense. Most people don't hold cash anymore. So their experience with dollars is digital too. And I think it's like 92% of US dollars are all digital. So their experience with money today is quite digital too. So really just giving someone a USB and saying that there's Bitcoin on here has worked to a certain extent. It doesn't work for everyone because still if I'm trying to explain this to my grandma, the idea that something valuable is on a USB isn't that convincing. But it's true. People can cross borders with billions of dollars in their pockets. Afghan refugees were doing that after, not billions of dollars, but they were doing that after the Taliban takeover. People were able to cross borders with their savings in their pockets. And that's novel. I mean, my family comes from revolutionary countries, and the story of of people like us is that you lose generational wealth. Your assets are gone and you have to start over. And you don't have to do that with Bitcoin, or Bitcoin allows you to have sort of an escape hatch from that.
Would there be a way to make something like a US dollar that's a bearer instrument that has, I mean, I guess you wouldn't want a private key on something that you're going to give to someone else that someone could see, but...
Well, we used to have these things called cassatious coins. So I think Trump was gifted one in Nashville by David Bailey. And I think that was a 1 Bitcoin cassatious coin. And they had private keys on them. So you are like, there is Bitcoin in that thing and it is bearer. So if you take it from me or I give it to you, like you now hold the Bitcoin yourself. And there are some companies that have attempted to do that as well. But we haven't seen like another iteration of that. This is back in 2013 with cassatious coins, at least, where they were like denominated, physical Bitcoin, basically. They're like the coins, they were, I think 1 Bitcoin, 5 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin. And so there was a clear like denomination system and it was in there. So that was early on. That was an attempt at that. That guy got arrested. So
do you remember what the charges were of what that was?
It was,
I'm sure a lot of people just are not even aware. So
yeah, it was, and I think it was 2013. It was that he was functioning as a mint. As far as I remember, no, and there are probably some more details, but he was basically being a mint, and they were saying you that's illegal. You can't do that, I guess.
So you go from having the guy that created this thing being arrested to one of the products being gifted to the
because
now
I mean,
president of the United States.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the thing itself isn't illegal. The act was
kind of like drugs.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a parallel there.
Yeah,
I guess that's right. Yeah,
not financial advice or legal advice.
Yeah, just life advice.
Hey guys, this episode is brought to you by OnRamp. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risks and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated, cold storage, multi-sig vault, guarded by 3 independent, institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. To learn more, schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team. Go to www.onrampbitcoin.com. So Hoseki is building towards a more connected financial world where Bitcoin is the global standard for money and proving reserves is secure and easy. Can you unpack that? And I'll give as a backdrop that you've worked with quite a few firms, including the Monochrome Bitcoin ETF, ticker IBTC, Bitwise, and Metaplanet. So like, what is Hoseki and what do you do and where is all of this going? So
what we do is wrap what I think is Bitcoin's most important characteristic, which is a sort of function of its scarcity, which is this like monetary accounting bit. Now that can be applied in a few different ways, and institutions and retail are both similar, and they have differences as well in this respect. So what we do is we're connecting Bitcoin into traditional finance. I don't think we're going to bulldoze the existing financial system and then build a new system, from the rubble. I think what we're going to do is sort of like how buildings are sort of demolished in the East, where they're floor by floor, piece by piece, and it's replaced with better infrastructure. I think that's what's going to happen, and I think we've been seeing that happen as well. I mean, the ETFs are kind of an example of that, where you're wrapping something traditional that you can hold in your retirement account, but ultimately it's Bitcoin that the thing represents, or that the thing is. So that's our whole objective is really being that bridge from Bitcoin into traditional finance. And our thesis is that one of the most important things you need to do if you're trying to financialize an asset is be able to prove that you own it. And we know that's a problem because that's been a topic that's been researched in the developing world at length. So this concept of debt capital, which is what most people in, let's say, Egypt, in Argentina, and Peru, in Zimbabwe experience, is that they hold assets, traditionally, for the most part, real estate, but they aren't able to turn that asset into capital. They don't have the legal or the financial infrastructure to have their physical asset be represented somewhere else and live this parallel life that, our assets live here. People buy and sell debt in the form of mortgages, and that's, a representational layer of the underlying thing. And that's how we generate capital. And that's how we generate, a mature, functioning, modern financial system. So for us, that's the most critical thing if we look at Bitcoin as a new financial system, which is how we see it. So that breaks down in a few different ways. On the retail side, it's being able to prove to a counterparty that you own Bitcoin in order to get credit. Now, what we're seeing right now is the incorporation of Bitcoin into your financial profile. So maybe you won't be extended credit simply because you have Bitcoin, but they'll be able to leverage that data and bake that into who you are as a borrower and have a much more complete overview. And that's also how they get more comfortable with the asset. Banks are scared when you talk about Bitcoin because they don't understand the thing itself, let alone custody, let alone trade and execution, and all the different sort of things that are siphoned from that. So understanding how many of their customers own Bitcoin today, marketing that they're open to assessing people that own Bitcoin for a lot of credit unions and small regional banks is really where most of the value is today. And on the institutional side, it's similar in the sense that it's more about building reputation or reputability, where they can prove to the public that they have the underlying. And they're not required to, so there's no regulation that forces them to do this. But they do this because they understand the ethos, they understand Bitcoin's value propositions. And for them, it shows that they're a more sophisticated player in the space, where they go above and beyond and do something that you don't do with any other financial asset. There's nothing that's sort of verified in real time like this. And to wrap my point up, the thing that was most frustrating for me, well, I built this from my own experience. I wasn't able to get a mortgage leveraging my Bitcoin, and that was frustrating. And what I felt at that point was I was told that if I hold my own keys, so if you're self-custodying, and we can maybe get into custody, I don't know if you think that would be helpful, but if you're self-custodying, I was told that you are your own bank. And what I quickly realized is that I don't have any banking services as my own bank. And so when we look at institutions and retail customers, I actually see them in the same bucket with respect to what they're trying to accomplish, or at least what they're able to do. Because at the level of the network, it doesn't matter if this is, a regulated financial institution that's holding this on-chain Bitcoin, or if it's you holding this on-chain Bitcoin. The network doesn't differentiate.
Have you had any conversation, or do you think you may in the future, with any of like the credit rating agencies, credit bureaus, where people are like, oh, my credit score is a 700? Like any conversations to date around that, or in the future, how could that maybe look?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, that's part of the vision, and we've had lots of conversations with a lot of different folks in that space, or for that use case. And that's my favorite sort of like mid to longer term application of what we're building, because the data is so rich. If you hold Bitcoin, if you're self-custodying Bitcoin, and let's say over the last 4 or 5 years, you've just been depositing Bitcoin into your wallet, and you've been accumulating Bitcoin, that says one thing about your profile as an investor in the space, or someone who holds the asset. If you have Bitcoin on Coinbase, for example, or on any exchange, and the balance changing frequently, and there's lots of transactions, and you're buying and selling, and maybe you're exposed to more than just Bitcoin, that says something else that says, a certain thing about that sort of investor, or like their profile. So, and there might be one person who's sort of a combination of the two. So the metrics that you can apply are pretty incredible in the sense that, if someone holds Bitcoin in a multi-sig, then
you can apply a certain rating to that or a certain like metric to that. If someone only holds Bitcoin on an exchange and maybe they're sort of random offshore exchanges that aren't that reputable or aren't that reliable, then that's a different sort of metric. And so accumulating all these different data points is really fascinating because again, it's novel. Like you can't apply these same parameters to other assets simply because you can't hold bonds yourself or self-custody bonds, for example. And the implications for that in terms of like building or financializing Bitcoin are massive.
What's your take on all of this kind of exploding corporate adoption, but only for like zombie companies? And like my theory is you're going to see it's like individuals came first, then corporates, but only the zombies, then institutions with the ETFs, and then nation states, and then the rest of corporates is like my guess. What's your guess?
It's people that don't have as much to lose, or institutions that don't have that much to lose. And I think that can be applied across all the different demographics, be it retail, be it governments or institutions. El Salvador was the first to adopt Bitcoin. I think it's because they simply had the most benefit and not a whole lot to lose. And same with people that adopted Bitcoin early on. I mean, the type of investor that invested in Bitcoin in 2014 is characteristically different than the type of investor that came in today. Different profiles altogether. But you know, there's a great article. I don't know if you've read it. It's called "Why the Yuppie Elite Dismiss Bitcoin," and
Jesse Myers.
Yeah, and it has this great matrix where you know I think it's high IQ at like the sort of extremes. It's high IQ and low trust in the system is where like the Bitcoin maximalist is. And high IQ and low trust in the system is where most of the people who have credentials that are valuable in society today. And they have high trust in the system because they've done all of the things in order to be part of effectively the elite class. And so for them to have missed Bitcoin is unacceptable. And it just can't be real. So I think the people who adopted it early on the retail side were sort of that demographic where they were smart, but for whatever reason, they didn't have the same trust in the system that I think most people have. And so with institutions and zombie companies, I think it's the same thing. I mean, they're looking for a way to survive and a way to, I mean, ideally at least survive, but also, you know, grow at an exponential rate. And so Bitcoin seems like sort of the best play, or frankly, I think the only play for them.
Proof of reserves. What is it in your words, and why is it important? And we'll get to traditional auditing in a bit.
Sure. It's just knowing that Bitcoin exists. That's really it.
Okay.
Why that's important is a bit multifaceted, but at the very least, it's just knowing that Bitcoin is there. And that application could be for ETF issuers, it could be for exchanges, for public companies, and also for governments. There are different. There's a different audience for each of those different use cases, but ultimately it's the same thing: is proving that the Bitcoin actually exists. For ETF issuers, it's knowing that the asset you hold, the stock in effect that you hold, the underlying exist. And we can maybe get into the auditing stuff in a bit, but that really is important for Bitcoin in a way that is, you know, just uncharacteristic with respect to other assets. So that's a really important part. The reason why proof of reserves is important is because the history of the space is rife with exchange hacks and insolvency crises. And a lot of those could have been, if not prevented, mitigated if they had some transparency. And that transparency is called proof of reserves. There's a bit of, and this is an issue with just naming things, especially with Bitcoin, because engineers were naming a lot of these things early on, and the thought wasn't necessarily what's going to be the best for, you know, market adoption or evangelization. It was what's the most functional term. So some of the difficulty with proof of reserves is understanding what it's looking at. So when I say that it's knowing the Bitcoin is there, that to us is proof of reserves, and that's what we've been promoting, and that's our definition of it, is knowing the Bitcoin is there. However, most people assume that it's both the Bitcoin and the liabilities. So if an exchange is holding some Bitcoin, then a proof of reserves can also prove that your Bitcoin that you're holding in a form of an IOU on an exchange actually exists. And that's really problematic because the asset side is a global ledger. It is truth. So that we know with certainty. and can prove with certainty that those assets exist. The liability side doesn't benefit from that same system. There's no public ledger of liabilities. If someone is representing the liabilities, then it's sort of like a trust me model. Because I can't audit the liabilities. I can't look at the whole book. Sure, you can Merkleize things and add cryptographic magic, but ultimately, if you're going to add some cryptographic mechanism to these liabilities, you're taking your books and pumping it into a thing, and then there's an output, and it looks complicated, and it is complicated, but it's not necessary, and it doesn't really do a whole lot either. So that's something that I focus on a lot in my talks, is differentiating the two and defining proof of reserves. In the FTX example, it seems incomplete. If you just have the assets, not the liabilities, okay, great, Bitcoin exists, but well, how many outstanding liabilities are there, and are they more than the assets? So if your liabilities are greater than your assets, you're insolvent. But again, it's sort of I think you risk misrepresenting things by reflecting both of those things in the same place at the same time, because people will assume that the guarantees are the same when they're not. Even if you have an auditor, it's still insufficient, and there's a lot of history around that and why that doesn't work. So one is trust Bitcoin, do not trust a person or people, trust the system, and the other one is trust people. And so proof of reserves for us is just proof of Bitcoin itself.
Got it. And can you explain proof of reserves as far as, is the existing traditional audit system that we have sufficient? Is it insufficient? How do these things maybe work together?
Yeah, wholly insufficient. We're applying legacy antiquated audit controls to a new asymmetric asset class, and they're not compatible. There's a few issues with assuming that the current audit standards are sufficient. One is the leveraging brand name auditors. I think for a lot of Bitcoiners, that's pretty obvious. You're back to just trusting institutions, or trusting like the system, or trusting big companies. And again, the ethos of the space is don't trust, verify. So that's for me, that's the first issue. People assume because there's some corporate brand name on it that it's good. And that does work for a lot of things. For example, when you're trying to get a mortgage, you take your statements. Your statement says Bank of America. It's got the letterhead. It's got the customer service line. That's something that is a household name. They trust that. So our first product was just that. It was a statements product that had our Hoseki letterhead, looked just like a bank statement. And they're more comfortable sort of with that, like JD Power and Associates, like stamp of approval type of thing, even though no one knows what that means.
Yeah.
And so that's the first problematic thing in my mind. Second is the reliance on government regulation, and simply the fact that, if they were fraudulent, the consequences are just, outsized, and they wouldn't dare to because the incentives are not in their favor. That's I think naive, especially with something like Bitcoin. And the last problematic point for me is the once a year audits. So if you're implementing a proof of reserves type of system in your whole audit process, that's happening once a year. And if something happens to the Bitcoin within that year, then you won't know until months later or a year later. And again, that is insufficient and unnecessary for Bitcoin, because it has properties that can prevent and mitigate any fraud and provide much better assurances in a real reliable way that doesn't depend on people or any company. So those 3 points are really sort of what I focus on when it comes to traditional audit and what proof of reserves does today. Auditors have sued each other consistently. The issue with, and I'm not an auditor, so a lot of this, frankly, is the sort of professional amateur thing where I don't know anything about audit. I don't come from audit, and I don't need to, because I can look at something as someone who's capable of understanding systems or understanding a concept, and simply, with my own 2 cents, make a determination if that's sensible or not, without understanding or knowing all the different sort of audit standards or audit requirements. That's a secondary thing for me. The most important thing is, does the Bitcoin exist? And if you're telling me that it does, but you have to do it sort of
in a periodic sense, and you have to do it in like a temporary method of verification, then that doesn't make sense to me, because I know that you don't have to do that with this asset. Maybe you have to do that with bonds. You have to do that with traditional financial instruments, and there are reasons for that, but those reasons don't exist for Bitcoin.
So this concept of point in time, I think, when you're kind of like zapping to where the Bitcoin is, you're like, yep, it's there. Is there a mechanism currently, or could there be? So you're not just waiting until the next time you check, or I guess you can check at any point in time, but is there a way to, for example, have anytime the amount of Bitcoin in that wallet, for sake of example, changes, you get an email notification? Like, is there anything like that, or on that topic, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do. That specifically, it depends on who's using it and for what. But that's a function of what we do.
Okay.
Is the real-time nature of it. So Hoseki Verified, our institutional product, is just that. It's a leaderboard of different institutions who have decided to become compliant, give us access to the Bitcoin data, and in that sense, meaning where it is and where it's housed. And then that's monitored in real time. So if things change, then now within maybe a 10 or 30 minute window, but you're effectively instantly notified. You can instantly see it because it has changed, and you don't have to wait for a quarterly audit or a yearly audit. And the reason why that's important is because being fraudulent with Bitcoin is infinitely easier than other assets. So if there is a rogue engineer or something, then and they have the right incentives that you can't predict, then they could very well just steal the Bitcoin, and you wouldn't know until a quarter later or a month later. And if we're building financial instruments on top of Bitcoin, and if we're really financializing it, then that becomes systemically risky in like a sort of 2008 financial crisis type of way. And that to me is, again, it's not only wrong, it's an incorrect way of using the asset.
Do you think there's a tipping point where more and more institutions, for example, kind of sign on to this way of life, and then it's just kind of the dominoes fall of like, if you're not doing it,
right,
you're like, well, why are you not doing
exactly.
it? That's a little odd.
And we're seeing that now. So we do work with regulators and try and guide policy, but the reason why we launched Hoseki Verified as a product is because we we're Bitcoiners in the company, and we love the idea of sort of self-regulation, or sort of organic rules that we decide collectively are important or are good, and make the system more performant. And so we're seeing that now, and that's honestly a dream come true, because I've been focusing on proof of reserves for 5 years now, and it's been my like nerdy focus in the space that no one cared about early on, and now it's gaining traction. And it's exactly that point. I think now companies are getting to a point, the ecosystem is getting to a point where you're almost expected to prove transparency, or at least adopt transparency in some respects, short of government regulation. And the reason why historically it hadn't been adopted was because, one, no one was forcing, and at that time it was mostly exchanges, no one was forcing them to be compliant. And B, their customers weren't demanding it, because that's a more technical concept, and you have to understand a bit more about Bitcoin to see that that's an option or a viable thing. So that's why historically it wasn't really gaining traction. But now with traditional institutions adopting it, that is the secret sauce. I mean, I was confused when it first happened, to be honest, because I thought exchanges would be the first adopters, but it seems like it was ETF issuers who were the first to kick down the door.
The Bitcoin for Corporations Conference is coming to Orlando May 6th and 7th. Receive 20% off admission by going to microstrategy.com, selecting Bitcoin for Corporations, and using discount code KOTZ at checkout, and I'll see you there. Hey guys, today's episode is brought to you by Stampseed. If you're in cold storage, you know how important it is to protect your seed phrase. That's why I recommend you head over to stampseed.com and check it out for yourself. This seed phrase storage device is one solid piece of titanium. There are no loose pieces, and you can hammer your seed phrase in letter by letter. When you go to stampseed.com, use promo code TIM15 for a 15% discount across the website. That's TIM15. What's your take on security and maybe some of the, and I'm probably not familiar, the corporate side of being a public company when it comes to showing or not showing addresses. Because, maybe we can say Coinbase, or maybe we can say publicly traded companies that they, for whatever reason, have not wanted to publish, and their customers have asked for it. Like, who's your custodian? Where's your Bitcoin? And they just have not done it. I assume, we know what assuming does, but we assume it's for one or several really good reasons, whether it's legal reasons, compliance, regulatory, security. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, and we've seen that, just given the experience with these companies, it's dependent on their comfort level. So what we've heard is this sort of regulatory ambiguity, where if you have your addresses public, then anyone can send funds to it because it's an open, decentralized system and permissionless. So anyone can send funds to it. And if you're receiving funds from OFAC sanctioned wallets, for example, from North Korea, let's say, then that can present a regulatory challenge or regulatory issue. And so they've been a bit more conservative in that respect, because the fact that they're being transparent in a real-time way is already radical. So to even go a step further and provide the literal address itself, for a lot of companies, I've been told and I've noticed that they are hesitant, because that's an even more radical sort of extension of this. In our opinion, showing the address is the most I guess, trying to think of the right word, the best way to do it. If there aren't corporate constraints or other type of constraints based on jurisdiction, that's the best way to accomplish this, because you don't want a third party who's this intermediary who's telling you that things are fine. And so that's been a critical part of our sort of implementation of proof of reserves, is understanding where these companies are, what they're comfortable with, and even if they're not ready to fully disclose their addresses, is getting them closer to that point. And so if there's this movement for companies to adopt proof of reserves, that already is a win. And maybe the second iteration of that is, okay, well, now there's a push to be transparent about the addresses, in addition to the fact that you're already being transparent about the Bitcoin that you own. So yeah, the regulatory ambiguity is the main constraint, in my opinion. I don't know why Coinbase isn't publishing theirs. Maybe that has something to do with it. But that's my best guess.
With the caveat that it could just, obviously be up to the company, whether it's an ETF issuer or someone else. I think, if my memory serves me, one of these ETF issuers did publish their address, and someone did send, and I'm going to mess up the details, but like 21 Satoshis, or they sent something to the address. How could a company kind of deal with that structure-wise? Like, do they like send it to a different wallet and just let it sit there? Is it all commingled? Is it like a PR and accounting nightmare to be like, well, we were just kind of gifted this and we don't know what to do with it? Yeah. Like, how does that work in reality?
I don't actually know the answer to this. What I would assume is that they send their funds to a different wallet and leave the funds that were sent there. Bitcoin benefits from what's called a UTXO model, in the sense that every Bitcoin transaction is like a physical check. It's not it's not like an accounting book where things are added on one side and subtracted on the other side. Every time you spend Bitcoin, you're actually destroying Bitcoin, and you're creating new conditions as to how that Bitcoin can now be spent. So at the accounting level, you can actually clearly sort of see where that is and what it is. So I would assume they're sending their funds to a different address. And it might be commingled. Again, that's more of like a determination of what that means in terms of accounting. So they could consider it commingled, which is where the ambiguity comes in. And I don't remember the ETF issuer now who went through that, but I do remember that happening.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's the Wild West, man.
Yeah. Like, this has never been a concern before, because you never had a digital asset like Bitcoin before.
Yeah. Yeah. You never had the possibility of having nefarious actors halfway across the world sending you money.
Yeah. Any specific things on your dashboard that you're working on that you can discuss at the moment, or like things that over the next 6 to 12 months you're kind of pushing towards?
Yeah, we have this new product that we're releasing now, based on some feedback that we got from our existing users. And one of the challenges in this space and doing what we're doing is, so it's this concept of category creation. There's no proof of reserves industry really. And
you're it.
Basically,
kind of.
Which is, it's a gamble, because if that works out, that works out, pretty incredibly. And if it doesn't work out, then it crashes and burns in a sense. And that's the risk that you take going into a space that isn't mature. So that applies to Bitcoin as a whole. But we're not an exchange. We're not a custodian. We're not a hardware device manufacturer. We're a proof of reserves company. And as we just went through, as we just discussed, that's not that well defined, and that's not anything on us. It's just not defined as an industry well. Mm-hmm. So the challenge here is communicating that message generally, understanding what existing terms can be, or the right analogies for applying this new way that we think money should be handled, and then is building the experience for that. So if you want to, let's just say with our credit unions and small regional banks, we give them a clean, so it's called Hoseki Connect. That's the product. And it's a plaid-like sort of experience where this widget pops up, you select where your Bitcoin is, and then you go ahead and prove control of it. And that's dependent on where the Bitcoin is being held. But logging into your bank account is infinitely easier than proving ownership of your self-custody device. It takes longer. It's weird because most people who hold it I don't think they understand the technicals of what is happening in the device itself with respect to custody, let alone the fact that you can now do something where you can prove that you own it. And most of these hardware devices allow you to do that. They've just never done that before because no one's asked them to, and it's a thing that people didn't know exists. And because of that, they didn't know that it could be useful. So communicating that's been a challenge. And we've had several iterations of that, but we have a product that we're releasing soon that is a really rich experience that is a nice hand-holding sort of experience for institutions to basically send you an email and in like a DocuSign sort of experience, then allow you to come on board, create your account, prove ownership of it, and give them all the financial details on the back end.
Awesome. Going back to Fidelity for a second, I'm just trying to imagine in my mind when you said that you were working, I believe, in the incubator, is the word you used. Is this like you're in the lab by yourself? Is it 2 people? Is it 200 people? And like, what are all of the spectrum of roles like in that room or offices or whatever?
So the incubator is made up of different sort of like focus divisions or like subgroups, basically. And one of them is digital assets. So Fidelity Digital Asset Services, what everyone thinks of and knows as Bitcoin at Fidelity, the institutional sort of product at Fidelity, that was a product in the incubator. It was a custody project, like a proof of concept custody project that got spun out into its own business unit, and that was early on. Unfortunately for me, I joined, I think, a week after COVID hit or 2 weeks after COVID hit, after moving to Boston for this. So I didn't benefit from the sort of lab experience. But in our team, it was a lot of folks. It was like 8 or 9 or 10 folks maybe that were working on different projects that were looking at digital assets in some capacity. And that was, honestly, it was such an amazing experience. It's a great company. The reason why I went to work there is because I met brilliant people who were working there. I'd talked to other financial institutions and met their digital asset groups. And I wasn't convinced that they actually sort of understand what it is that they're attempting to build or attempting to learn more about. But Fidelity did. There was some, like Amanda Fabiano, who's a mining expert, was one of the first people I met. Alex Thorne, who's now at Galaxy Digital as well. And the Wall Street Journal wrote this article about the Fidelity Mafia, which I think was a self-coined term that did end up taking off. And there are a number of people that came out of Fidelity. Castle Island, for instance, Nick Carter and Matt Walsh were both there. Thomas Pacchia from Pubkey also was at Fidelity. So that really speaks to the leadership at Fidelity, because that's how you can recruit these type of people. And a lot of those folks were actually internal who, the firm identified that these are people that have some asymmetric understanding about this, and let's sort of bring them in and let's put them in a lab and see what comes out of it. So the internal education was awesome. Because I was on Twitter just nonstop, much more than I am now, you do have access to knowledge that other people just don't have. Of, like respectable, like very intellectual people in the Bitcoin space that you wouldn't know if you weren't on Twitter. And so that randomly was a useful sort of tool and a useful skill. So, we ran conferences internally, educating people in Fidelity about what Bitcoin is. We had a privacy conference, for example. So that, and then the work with MIT and some other folks was really a dream come true. I mean, going from working on sort of like in a garage band sense, working on these weird niche crypto projects in Miami in 2017, 18, and then moving over to a brand name, financial institution on Wall Street, and being given the sort of credence to build what I thought was the most useful thing there was, an absolute blessing.
I guess I'll throw it over to you for any closing thoughts, and where can people reach out to you and the company online?
Sure. So my Twitter is at Sam Abbassi. It's 2 B's and 2 S's. The company website is hoseki.app, Hoseki app on Twitter as well. And my email is sam@hoseki.app. Closing thoughts are really just, I want to reiterate this concept of scarcity and what that means for money. That really is a characteristic that I think will be more important over time. And that's a foundational building block of building this new financial paradigm. I want to impress that, and obviously invite more people to Bitcoin.
Awesome. Sam, thanks so much.
Thank you.